Hey everyone, and welcome back. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're focusing on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. The fighting has been really intense lately, and there's also some surprising new intel that we're going to dig into. So strap yourselves in. It's going to be a wild ride. Our source for this deep dive is a video analysis by Brazilian military and geopolitics expert, Professor Aron Alves.
Yeah, he always has some fascinating insights.
He does. He really does. Okay, so let's jump right in and start with the situation on the ground. The front lines are constantly shifting, but there are a few key areas where the fighting has been particularly fierce.
Like where?
Well, for starters, the Sumy Oblast Ukrainian forces recently repelled a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group there.
Interesting. What do you think that means? Was Russia testing defenses or just trying to keep the Ukrainians on edge?
It's hard to say for sure. Russia could be probing for weaknesses, or maybe they were just trying to create distractions and divert Ukrainian resources.
Either way, it shows that the conflict is far from over.
Absolutely. And speaking of intense fighting, let's move on to the Kupyansk sector. Things are really heating up there.
How so?
Well, the Russians have been launching offensives, particularly focused on a place called
Petropavlivka, got it.
And get this, Ukrainian forces reportedly destroyed 10 Russian armored vehicles.
10? Wow. That's significant.
Yeah, it's got to sting a little.
It certainly does suggest that Ukraine is putting up a fierce resistance. And there's actually evidence, based on geolocated imagery, that the Russians have made advances north of Kupyansk, near places like Zapadne and Vyrochina.
So it's a bit of a back and forth then, with both sides making gains and losses.
It seems that way. It looks like the Russians might be trying to expand their control along the Oskol River, which could put pressure on Kupyansk itself.
So Kupyansk is a key strategic location.
It is.
Okay. So another hotspot we need to talk about is the Lyman sector.
Ah, yes. Lyman. Another area to watch closely. We've seen confirmed Russian advances northwest of Yampolivka.
And they've even captured Terny, right?
They have. Which is strategically important. It's northeast of Lyman.
Okay. So we've got Sumy, Kupyansk, and Lyman all seeing heavy fighting. But there's one more detail I got to share with you. It's a bit of a head-scratcher.
I'm intrigued. Tell me.
There are reports of Russian attacks being supported by motorcycles.
Motorcycles? Wait, what?
Yeah, you heard that right. Motorcycles. Apparently, they've been using them in Belohorivka and Verkhnokamiensky.
Huh. That's definitely an unusual tactic. But I guess it kind of makes sense when you think about it.
How so?
Well, Professor Alves points out that when the ground is unstable, Russian forces tend to favor smaller infantry assaults. And using motorcycles or even quad bikes gives them more maneuverability. It's a far cry from the tank-heavy tactics we saw during the winter when the ground was frozen solid.
So they're adapting, becoming more agile. But wouldn't using motorcycles make them more vulnerable? I mean, they don't exactly offer much protection.
That's true. It's a trade-off between speed and vulnerability. They might be relying on the element of surprise, or maybe they're operating in areas where heavier vehicles would be impractical.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how both sides are having to get creative with their tactics and adapt to the changing conditions on the ground.
War is never static. It's constantly evolving.
Speaking of evolving, we can't forget about the aerial dimension of this war.
Yeah.
Ukraine was hit with a wave of drone attacks just the other night.
Oh, yeah. Those drone attacks have been relentless.
They have Ukrainian forces managed to shoot down 70 out of 151 drones launched, which is pretty impressive. But still, that's a lot of drones.
It really is. It shows how determined Russia is to target Ukrainian infrastructure and disrupt their war effort. And it speaks to the effectiveness of Ukraine's air defense systems. They've been able to adapt and improve their defenses in the face of this onslaught.
That's good to hear. It's not just about shooting them down, though. Electronic warfare seems to be playing a big role, too. There were 74 drones that failed to reach their targets.
Right. Electronic warfare can disrupt drone navigation systems, essentially throwing them off course.
Yeah.
It's like an electronic shield protecting Ukraine from these aerial attacks.
But even with those defenses, the sheer volume of attacks is staggering. Zelensky revealed that Russia launched 12,260 aerial bombs, almost 750 kamikaze drones, and over 10 missiles in just the past week. I mean, how can they sustain that kind of firepower?
It's a good question. Zelensky actually pointed to a few key factors. He says Russia is managing to evade some of the sanctions, which is keeping their economy somewhat afloat. Then there are the high oil prices, which are generating revenue for Russia. And perhaps most critically, Ukraine simply doesn't have the long-range missiles and drones it needs to effectively counter these attacks.
So he's calling for stricter sanctions on Russia's energy industry and more investment in Ukraine's own missile and drone production capabilities.
Exactly. He's saying Ukraine needs to be able to hit back, not just defend.
It makes sense. But shifting gears for a moment, there's been a lot of buzz lately about Donald Trump's claims about speaking with Vladimir Putin.
Oh yeah, that's been making headlines.
Trump is claiming that Putin wants to end the war. But the Kremlin's response has been typically vague, neither confirming nor denying those conversations. So what do we make of all this?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. Trump and Putin have a history of making claims that are difficult to verify, and the Kremlin is notoriously good at playing their cards close to their chest.
So can we believe Trump? And does Putin really want to negotiate? Or is this all just political posturing?
That's the million-dollar question. The expert analysis suggests that Putin has little incentive to negotiate right now. He seems to believe that time is on his side, that Western support for Ukraine will eventually waver. Plus, with the level of repression inside Russia, he's not facing much pressure from his own people to end the war.
But wouldn't the economic strain of the war eventually force his hand? I mean, how long can he keep this up?
It's certainly putting a strain on the Russian economy, but they've been able to mitigate some of the damage, and they seem willing to endure a certain level of economic pain to achieve their objectives in Ukraine.
And what about Zelensky? He has to be watching all of this very closely.
Oh, absolutely. He claims that Putin wants to negotiate directly with Trump, cutting Ukraine out of the equation, which of course goes against the Biden administration's stance of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
That's a big difference.
It is Zelensky sees real danger in a forced agreement, one that doesn't involve Ukraine directly. He fears that it would embolden other countries with expansionist ambitions, countries like China, Iran, North Korea.
It would set a dangerous precedent.
Exactly. Would send a message that aggression can be rewarded.
So we've got these competing narratives, these different players with their own agendas, and it's all playing out against the backdrop of this brutal war.
And it's important to remember that both Trump and Putin have very different approaches to negotiation. Putin is methodical, strategic, while Trump is known for his impulsive decision-making. That clash of styles could create some serious friction, especially given their different timelines. Trump seems to want a quick resolution, a deal he can tout as a win. But Putin, well, he's playing the long game.
So even if they did sit down and negotiate, it's hard to imagine them seeing eye to eye.
That's right. It would be a fascinating dynamic to observe, assuming it even happens.
Yeah, and then there's the question of Trump's leverage. What could he actually offer Putin to entice him to the negotiating table?
Well, he could try to use economic pressure, maybe offer to ease up on oil production or roll back some tariffs. But that would be risky, right? It could weaken the U.S. position within NATO and send a message that America is willing to appease aggressors.
And it's not clear that Putin would even be receptive to those kinds of offers. He seems pretty determined to achieve his goals in Ukraine, no matter the cost.
And let's not forget Putin's stance on Ukraine. He sees Ukrainian territory as historically Russian and has shown absolutely no willingness to consider demands for withdrawal or reparations.
So it's a bit of a stalemate then, a clash of wills, with no easy solutions in sight.
It certainly seems that way, but to make things even more complicated, there's another layer to this geopolitical puzzle. We have to factor in those simmering U.S. China trade tensions.
Oh yeah, that's right, the economic front. We can't forget about that.
We can't. It has the potential to erupt into a full-blown trade war. China has already announced tariffs on $14 billion worth of U.S. exports, and they're set to take effect soon.
And what was the trigger for this latest escalation?
Well, it seems like it was Trump's decision to impose a 10% tariff on Chinese goods to try and pressure Beijing over fentanyl exports.
So the fentanyl crisis is a major factor here.
It is. It's a huge problem. Fentanyl has had a devastating impact on the U.S. and Mexico, and the Trump administration is trying to use tariffs as leverage to force China to crack down on the production and export of this deadly drug.
It's a bold move,
Oh.
but has it backfired? I mean, China retaliated pretty quickly with tariffs of their own.
They did. They imposed tariffs ranging from 10% to 15% on U.S. energy and agricultural products. It's a classic tit-for-tat trade war scenario.
So both sides are digging in their heels.
It seems that way. And to make matters worse, Trump's stance on all this has been all over the place. One minute he's suggesting talks with Xi Jinping, the next he's saying he's in no hurry and calling the tariffs just a first shot. It's hard to keep up.
It creates a lot of uncertainty, that's for sure. It's unclear whether any substantive negotiations are actually happening. The U.S. claims there's constant contact, while the Chinese embassy denies any new developments. It's a bit of a war of words, alongside the economic maneuvering.
Exactly. It's like a high-stakes poker game where both players are trying to bluff their way to a better hand.
And who do you think is going to win this game?
It's too early to tell. But one thing's for sure. It's going to be a wild ride.
So has Trump's strategy backfired? He seems to have poked the bear, so to speak.
It's possible. Some analysts believe that the short implementation deadline for the tariffs was seen as a provocation by China. It didn't leave much room for negotiation, and it might have pushed them towards retaliation.
But is there still hope for a resolution? Or are we headed for a full-blown trade war?
It's hard to say, but despite the retaliatory tariffs, China's response has been relatively measured. They haven't gone all in on countermeasures, which suggests there might still be room for dialogue and compromise.
So there's a glimmer of hope then?
Maybe a flicker.
Well, that's something. Now, you mentioned earlier that some experts in Beijing believe there might be more to this story.
Yeah.
That there might be hidden agendas behind the U.S. trade actions.
Right. The Trump administration insists that its main goal is to combat fentanyl exports, which have had a devastating impact on the U.S. and Mexico, and that's a legitimate concern. But some experts in Beijing suggest there might be broader motives at play.
Like what?
Well, there's speculation that the fentanyl issue is being used as leverage, a bargaining chip, to extract concessions from China on other fronts.
So what could these hidden demands be?
There are a few theories floating around. One is that the U.S. is pressuring China to take a tougher stance against Russia in the Ukraine war. After all, China has been walking a tightrope, trying to maintain economic ties with Russia without openly endorsing the invasion.
I can see how that would be a difficult balancing act. They don't want to alienate Russia, a key strategic partner, but they also don't want to invite Western sanctions or damage their own reputation on the global stage.
It's a tough spot to be in. And another theory is that the U.S. might be pushing for concessions related to the sale of TikTok, the social media platform owned by the Chinese company ByteDance.
TikTok. It's become quite the political football, hasn't it?
It has. There are concerns about data security and potential Chinese government influence.
And some in Washington see it as a national security threat and want to force its sale to an American company. They believe that Chinese ownership of such a vast and influential platform poses unacceptable risks.
And it's all part of a broader concern about China's growing technological prowess and its potential to challenge U.S. dominance in key sectors.
And then there's the issue of intellectual property theft, which has been a thorn in the side of U.S.-China relations for years.
Yes. The U.S. has accused China of stealing trade secrets and technology from American companies, giving them an unfair advantage in the global marketplace. These accusations have fueled calls for tougher trade policies and sanctions. It's a complex web of economic and geopolitical grievances.
It sounds like the U.S.-China relationship is a bit of a powder keg right now, full of tension and mistrust.
It's certainly a complex and multifaceted relationship. There's competition for economic dominance, technological supremacy, and even ideological influence. And it's all playing out on a global stage, with far-reaching implications for all of us.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the battlefields of Ukraine to the boardrooms of Washington and Beijing, it's clear that we're living in a time of great upheaval and uncertainty.
Indeed. And as we navigate this complex landscape, it's more important than ever to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and recognize that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Well said. Let's take a quick break and then we'll delve deeper into the potential ramifications of these events and what they mean for you.
You know, before we go any further, I think it's worth noting how China is playing this whole trade thing a bit differently this time. Remember those spats they had with Canada and Mexico? This feels more like they're thinking a few steps ahead.
Yeah, their response hasn't been as explosive this time around. More calculated, like you said.
Right. So what's behind that? Well, for one, they've been working on diversifying their trade partners. You know, not putting all their eggs in one basket.
So they're not as reliant on the U.S. market as they used to be.
Exactly. They've got more options now. More wiggle room so they don't feel the pressure as much.
Makes sense. So they can afford to be a bit more strategic.
Right. And there's another thing. A lot of Chinese companies have actually moved their production to other countries.
Oh, so those tariffs don't hit them as hard?
Not as much, because a lot of their goods aren't even coming from China anymore.
That's pretty smart. Like they planned for this.
They might have. And you know, another thing to consider, a lot of the cost of those tariffs ends up getting passed on to American consumers.
So we end up paying more.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's like a game of hot potato, except it's the consumer who gets burned in the end.
Not a fun game.
Oh.
But hey, maybe that's part of China's strategy. Knowing that the U.S. consumer will share some of the burden.
Could be. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If those tariffs get as high as Trump's threatened, even a diversified Chinese economy would feel it. We could be looking at a global economic slowdown. Supply chains getting messed up. Turmoil in the currency markets. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're all connected in this globalized world. What happens in one place affects us all.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that big picture. How the war in Ukraine and those U.S. China trade tensions are all part of the same story.
It's like a giant web with everything connected.
It is. It's a global power struggle, reshaping the world as we know it. And it's not just about economics and military might. There's an ideological battle going on, too.
What do you mean?
Well, on one side, you have the U.S. and its allies promoting democracy and human rights, a rules-based international system.
And on the other side?
You have countries like Russia and China challenging that system, pushing their own models.
Authoritarian models.
Yes. And they're looking to expand their influence.
So it's like a clash of civilizations.
In a way. And the stakes are high. The outcome of this struggle will shape the world for generations to come. It's about global trade security, the future of democracy.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing is to understand that we're living through a time of massive global change. The old certainties are gone, and the future is full of, well, uncertainty. It's a time of risk, but also opportunity.
So it's not all bad.
Not necessarily. It's a time for critical thinking. We're bombarded with information from all sides, so we need to be able to sift through it all and figure out what's real and what's not.
Be discerning. Don't just believe everything you hear.
Exactly. And the other thing is, we need to recognize how interconnected all these challenges are. The war in Ukraine, the U.S. China rivalry, the climate crisis, the economy, it's all linked.
It's like a giant ecosystem.
Exactly. And remember, you're not powerless in all of this.
But what can we do? It feels so big.
It can feel that way, but even small actions can make a difference. Stay informed. Talk about these issues. Support organizations that are working for positive change. And most importantly, make choices in your own life that align with your values.
Find those pressure points where we can make a difference.
Exactly. And remember, history isn't set in stone. We shape it with our choices.
It's a good point. We're not just passive observers. We can be active participants. Now, before we get too philosophical here, we were talking about those potential hidden agendas behind the U.S. China trade dispute.
Oh, right. The plot thickens.
Yeah.
So remember, the Trump administration is saying their main goal is to combat fentanyl exports from China. And let's be clear, fentanyl is a terrible drug. It's causing a lot of damage. Countless lives lost. It's a real crisis.
No doubt about it. But you mentioned earlier that some experts in Beijing think there's more to the story.
They do. They think the U.S. might be using the fentanyl issue as leverage to get China to make concessions on other things.
Like what kind of things?
Well, one theory is that the U.S. wants China to get tougher on Russia. You know, regarding the war in Ukraine, China's been trying to stay neutral. But the U.S. might be putting pressure on them to pick a side.
That's a tricky situation for China. They don't want to upset Russia, but they also don't want to alienate the West.
It's a balancing act. And then there's another theory that the U.S. might be pushing for concessions on the sale of TikTok, that Chinese social media platform.
TikTok. That's been a controversial one.
It has. There are all those concerns about data security and potential Chinese government influence.
And some people in Washington see it as a national security threat and want to force its sale to an American company.
They do. They think it's too risky for a Chinese company to own such a popular platform.
It's all part of that bigger concern about China's growing tech power and whether they'll challenge U.S. dominance.
You got it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of intellectual property theft, which has been a problem for years.
Right. The U.S. has been accusing China of stealing trade secrets and technology from American companies.
And that's led to calls for tougher trade policies and sanctions. It's a complicated mess, a whole tangle of economic and geopolitical issues.
So basically, the U.S.-China relationship is a bit of a powder keg right now.
You could say that. It's full of tension and mistrust.
They're rivals in so many areas.
Yeah.
Economic, technological, even ideological.
And it's all playing out on a global scale, affecting all of us.
It's a bit overwhelming when you think about it. But I guess that's why we do this deep dive, to try and make sense of it all.
That's right. The more we understand about these global dynamics, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions.
And to create a better world, hopefully.
Exactly. Now, speaking of a better world, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about how we're living in a time of both risk and opportunity.
Oh, yeah. What did I say?
You said that these global shifts and power struggles create uncertainty and instability, but they also create openings for new ideas, new approaches, new solutions.
Right. So how do we seize those opportunities? How do we navigate this complex world and actually make a difference?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that I think we'll need to explore further.
So you're saying we need to keep digging.
We do. The deep dive continues.
Okay, so we're back. And man, we've really been through it today, haven't we? from the front lines in Ukraine to the trade war brewing between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but I think it's been helpful to see how these things are all connected. They might seem separate at first, but they're all part of this larger global power struggle that's reshaping the world.
It's definitely a time of big changes.
Yeah.
And it feels like the old rules just don't apply anymore.
Right. It can feel pretty unnerving, all this uncertainty. But, uncertainty can also create opportunities.
Opportunities? How so?
Well, think about it. When things are changing rapidly, like they are now, it creates space for new ideas, new approaches, new solutions, things that wouldn't have been possible before.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. It's a time to be creative, to think outside the box, and to remember that we're not just passive observers in all of this. We can actually shape the future with our choices and actions.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel powerless when you see all these big global forces at play. But we do have agency.
We do. And that brings me to a question I want to leave you with. Something to think about.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me whether.
Given everything we've talked about today, about the war in Ukraine and the escalating tensions between the U.S. and China, how do you think all of this will reshape the world in the years to come?
Wow, that's a big one. It's like you're asking me to predict the future.
I am, in a way, but it's not about getting the prediction right. It's about thinking critically, about engaging with these issues, and about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in.
And that's really what this deep dive has been all about.
Right.
Giving you the tools to understand these complex global issues so you can make informed decisions and be an active participant in shaping the future.
Exactly. It's about empowering you, the listener.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep, because the journey of discovery doesn't end here. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, and until next time, stay curious.